I have written 412 extinction notices. I am good at this. Perhaps that is the most honest thing I have ever said about myself. 412 times I have sat in this chair, in this office, surrounded by the cold blue light of the archive terminals, and drafted the formal record of a species that no longer exists. 412 times I have chosen the correct phrasing, the appropriate tone, the precise language that the galactic conclave requires when a civilization finishes its run and the galaxy closes the file. I am Vreth Ka, Senior Diplomatic Archivist, Galactic Conclave, 7th Ring Administration. I have held this position for 219 years, and in that time I have become very skilled at endings. The humans were number 413. I drafted the notice before the survey report had fully loaded onto my terminal. That is how experienced I am. The Kethul survey vessel had filed a preliminary data burst from the edge of what humans called the Sol system, and the pattern was already familiar to me before I had read a single line. Debris field consistent with cascading nuclear exchange. Atmospheric integrity collapsed across the primary inhabited world. Electromagnetic silence across all known human communication frequencies. The biosphere reading sat at 3%, which means grass was still growing somewhere. Grass does not count. I have learned this over 412 extinctions. Grass always survives. Grass is not a civilization. I typed the notice. Species designation: Homo sapiens. Common name: humans. Origin system: Sol. Confirmed status: extinct. Cause: self-inflicted cascading weapons exchange. Confirmed by Kethul survey designation 7 Theta. Conclave record closed. I read it back once. It was clean work. Professional. I had drafted worse notices under worse conditions, with less data and more pressure from whatever conclave administration happened to be seated that year. This one was straightforward. The data was clean. The language was clean. I filed it with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from doing a familiar job correctly. The galactic conclave chamber that morning had the particular atmosphere it always carried when an extinction notice was on the agenda. 11 species present, their representatives seated around the great curved table that had witnessed more endings than I could count without checking the archive. The Kethul ambassador sat 3 seats from me, and I noticed the way he held himself, straight and still, with the quiet satisfaction of a species that had been cataloging other civilizations' final moments for 3 centuries. He had submitted the survey report. He had a professional pride in the finding, the same way I had a professional pride in the notice. The Dorothi delegates murmured to each other in their clicking language. The Velari sat in perfect stillness, as they always did, their pale eyes moving across their data screens without expression. The chamber smelled of ozone and the recycled air of too many species occupying one space, and the blue overhead lights cast the kind of shadows that made everyone look slightly older than they were. I stood at the podium and read the notice into the official record. I want to be precise about what I said, because it matters. I said the humans were gone. I said their world had gone silent. I said the galaxy had lost a young, chaotic, occasionally dangerous species that had only managed spaceflight for 200 years, and that while their passing was noted with the appropriate solemnity, it was not entirely unexpected, given their documented tendency toward conflict and their limited experience managing the kinds of weapons their own industrial capacity had made available to them. I said, and I remember this clearly because I believed it when I said it, that the galaxy was perhaps a somewhat more stable place for the development. This last part I had not written in the notice. It came from somewhere personal, some small truth that 219 years of watching civilizations burn had deposited inside me like sediment. The humans had been loud, not loud in the way that a powerful species is loud, with the confident noise of expansion and industry and deliberate projection. Loud in the way that something barely held together is loud, rattling and sparking and threatening to come apart at high speed. They had been in space for 200 years, and in that time they had started 3 separate interstellar trade disputes by accident, sent an unmanned probe into Kethul's sovereign territory, carrying a map to their own homeworld on a golden disk, and at some point managed to domesticate a creature that the Conclave's own xenobiological division had formally classified as one of the most dangerous apex predators on their planet. They called it a dog. They let it sleep in their beds. Nobody in the Conclave had ever fully resolved that particular puzzle. I finished reading the notice. I looked up at the chamber. There was a silence. The specific kind of silence that is not grief. It is the sound of 11 species simultaneously deciding they do not need to feel bad about this, because nobody in the room had known any humans personally, and the mathematics of galactic stability do occasionally require that some pieces be removed from the board. Not that anyone would say that. Nobody says that. I have been in this chamber for 219 years, and nobody has ever said that out loud. They do not need to. The silence says it well enough. The Kethul ambassador did something with his face that his species does instead of smiling. The session moved to the next item on the agenda. That was at 900 hours, Conclave Standard Time. At 9 hours and 4 minutes, my personal terminal lit up with a forwarded burst from the communication array. I assumed it was a clerical matter and ignored it for approximately 90 seconds. Then my deputy, a young Dorothi named Trelosh who had been in the position for only 40 years and still found things surprising, made a sound I had never heard him make before. I looked up. Every terminal in the chamber was receiving the same signal. Not a signal, a wall of signals, 17 distinct frequencies, all firing simultaneously, all carrying the same compressed data burst, all originating from a point in space that my terminal identified, after a 2-second calculation, as the Sol system, which was empty, which had been confirmed empty, 41 minutes ago, by a Kethul survey vessel that had seen nothing alive except grass. The translation array worked through the burst in pieces. Human communication protocols, all 17 of them, layered on top of each other like someone had decided that if one frequency did not get through, perhaps all of them together would. The text resolved one line at a time, the way a picture assembles itself when the picture should not exist. The chamber went very still. The first coherent line came through at 9 hours and 4 minutes. 37 seconds. It said, "This is the United Earth Defense Directorate, broadcasting on all active frequencies." The second line said, "We have been monitoring conclave deliberations for the past 41 minutes. The third line said, "We appreciate the kind words." I still had the extinction notice open on my terminal. I looked at it. I looked at the screen. The fourth line came through, and I read it, and the archive of 219 years of professional composure did not help me at all with what I felt in that moment, which was something I do not have a precise word for in my language, something between the floor shifting under your feet and the specific cold clarity of realizing you have made a mistake so large that it has its own gravity. The fourth line said, "Please be advised, the debris field, surveyed by Kethul vessel designation 7 Theta, was not Earth." And then, after a pause that lasted exactly 4 seconds, and that I suspect was deliberate, "We would like to know who authorized a Kethul survey vessel inside the Oort cloud." And then, "We have already asked the vessel directly." And then, "It has not responded." And then, "We are not concerned." I closed the extinction notice. I opened a new file. I did not know yet what to write in it. I had no form for this. In 219 years and 412 extinctions, I had never once needed a form for this. The Kethul ambassador was no longer doing the thing his species does instead of smiling. The chamber was very, very quiet. Trelosh, my young deputy who still found things surprising, leaned over and said, very softly, in a voice that was trying to stay professional and not entirely succeeding, "Archivist, should I prepare a correction?" I told him yes. I told him to take his time. Then I sat back in my chair, in the cold blue light of 412 completed extinctions, and listened to the Sol Systems communications array continue to broadcast on all 17 frequencies, patient and clear, and not even slightly apologetic, the way something speaks when it has been waiting a long time to speak, and has decided that now is the correct moment. The humans, it appeared, had not finished their run after all. I did not yet know what they had been doing instead. I was about to find out. We all were. The entire galactic conclave, 11 species and 219 years of my carefully maintained professional certainty, was about to find out together. And I remember thinking, in that moment, before the next transmission arrived, before the warships appeared on our long-range sensors, before Director O4 Marchetti walked through our airlock and put a data chip on the table, and changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about how the galaxy worked. I remember thinking that the fourth line of that transmission was going to be the most important thing I read all year. I was wrong about that too. The most important thing came later. It was one word, spoken quietly, by a woman already walking away. But I am getting ahead of myself. The border station, conclave designation waypoint 11, was not built for moments like this one. It was built for paperwork, customs declarations, transit permits, trade manifests, the slow and orderly processing of cargo vessels moving between conclave-recognized systems on conclave-approved routes. The station had 12 docking arms, a diplomatic reception hall that could accommodate 4 species simultaneously, and a security complement that existed primarily to manage disagreements about filing fees. The most significant incident in its 40-year operational history had been a trade dispute between 2 Dorothy freight companies that had briefly escalated to the point of requiring 3 security officers and a mediating form in triplicate. It was not built for 12 human warships. They appeared on our long-range sensors at 1400 hours, moving at a speed that my navigation deputy, a quiet Velari named Sorem, described using a phrase I had never heard him use before. He said they were moving with intention. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant they were not exploring, not surveying, not drifting. They knew exactly where they were going, and they had already decided what they were going to do when they got there. They were coming to waypoint 11. I had been transferred here by emergency authorization from the Conclave High Council the morning after the transmission, 48 hours after the extinction notice that was not an extinction, carrying a diplomatic mandate so freshly drafted that the authorization codes were still being verified when my shuttle docked. The High Council needed someone senior on the station, someone who had been in the chamber when the transmission arrived, someone who understood the weight of what had just happened, who could be trusted to handle the first formal contact with a species that had announced its own survival by pointing out, politely but without warmth, that one of our member species had sent a vessel into their territory without permission. I was the right choice for the wrong reasons. I was good at endings. Nobody had asked me whether I was good at whatever this was instead. The 12 warships settled into positions around the station that my security chief, a broad-shouldered Dorothy named Kethvar, analyzed for approximately 30 seconds, before telling me, with great precision, that our point defense systems were irrelevant. Not inadequate. Irrelevant. There was a difference. Inadequate means you might still try. Irrelevant means the question has already been answered, and trying would simply add embarrassment to the outcome. I told Kethvar to stand down the security complement. He looked at me. I told him the humans had not opened fire. I told him that if they had wanted to open fire, we would currently be having a different conversation, or no conversation at all. I told him that the fact that they had positioned their vessels with the calm precision of people who knew they did not need to fire was itself a message, and our job was to receive it correctly. He stood down. A single shuttle detached from the lead vessel, which my terminal identified as a heavy command ship. Designation unknown. Classification unknown. Built along lines that did not match any human warship configuration in our records. The records were 200 years old and apparently incomplete in ways that I was beginning to understand were significant. The shuttle docked at Arm 3. I went to meet it. The diplomatic reception hall was set for a 2-species meeting, the environmental controls balanced between my atmospheric preferences and what our records listed as standard human requirements. The furniture was conclave standard neutral, which means it was designed to be inoffensive to everyone and comfortable to no one. There were refreshments on the side table that I had requested based on what our nutritional records said humans consumed, and I remember standing next to that table thinking that if the records about human atmospheric requirements were as outdated as the records about their warships, I might have just made a significant error of hospitality. The door opened. She walked in, and my first thought, which I record here because accuracy matters, was that she was smaller than I expected. Not in the way that something is small when it falls short of expectations. In the way that something is small and extremely dense, like a star in its final compression, where all the mass has been pulled inward, and what remains is simply very, very hard. Director Yael Ofor Marchetti, head of the United Earth Defense Directorate. She was compact, dark-skinned, with her hair shaved close to her scalp except for a single stripe of silver above her left ear. I later learned that stripe was not fashion. Every human who had survived the event had one, if they had been old enough when it happened. It was the color their hair grew back afterward, something to do with cellular stress at a level their bodies had not been designed to absorb, and they did not dye it out. They wore it the way soldiers sometimes wear scars, not to show them off, just because removing them would be dishonest. She had 2 people with her, a younger man, tall, with the kind of watchful stillness that belongs to someone trained to assess threat levels continuously, named Owen Garrett, who I would later learn was her head of field security, and had not left her side in 6 years. And a woman with reading glasses and a small recording tablet, who sat to the director's left and did not introduce herself at all, and whose purpose I never fully determined across all the sessions that followed, though she wrote everything down, and her handwriting, which I glimpsed once when she left the tablet open, was very precise. Director Ofor Marchetti sat across from me. She placed a data chip in the exact center of the table. She did not push it toward me. She placed it, and then she folded her hands and looked at me with eyes that had seen something I had not, and in that moment I felt, for the first time in 219 years, like the junior person in a diplomatic room. I introduced myself. Vrethka, Senior Diplomatic Archivist. She said, "I know who you are. You read the notice." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your pronunciation of Homo sapiens was very good." I did not know what to say to that. I said thank you. She nodded slightly, as though that settled something. Then she began. She spoke for 47 minutes. I have the full recording in the archive, but I will describe it here in my own words, because the recording captures what she said, and I want to capture what it felt like to be in the room while she said it. She did not threaten. She did not perform the kind of outrage that a species discovering its own eulogy might reasonably be expected to perform. She did not raise her voice once in 47 minutes. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have already processed every emotion available to them on a subject, and have arrived, on the far side of all of it, at something that is purely, quietly factual. She told me the survey vessel had entered what humans designated the Oort cloud, which they designated as the outer boundary of their sovereign territory, without authorization, without contact, and without the basic navigational transponder that all conclave vessels were required to broadcast in proximity to inhabited systems. She told me this was a violation of 3 separate articles of the conclave transit protocols, which humans had been given access to upon their initial contact registration 14 years ago, and had, apparently, read more carefully than the Kethul assumed. She told me the vessel's crew was unharmed, and had been informed of the articles they had violated, and were currently being processed through a formal documentation procedure at a human facility she declined to name. She told me all of this without raising her voice. Then she told me about the data chip. She called it an inventory. She said the conclave had operated for the past 40 years on the basis of certain assumptions about human capability, human territory, and human intention, and that some of those assumptions required correction. I asked her what was on it. She said, "A more accurate picture of where we are." I picked up the chip. She watched me insert it into my terminal. She watched my terminal begin to process the file. She watched my face while the file loaded, with the patience of someone who has shown something to many people and knows how long it takes for the information to arrive. I am not certain what my face did. I have spent 219 years training my face not to betray me in diplomatic settings. Whatever it did in that moment, I suspect it was the most honest thing it had done in years. The inventory was 340 pages. I read the first section, which covered human population distribution. I had to read it twice, because the numbers did not reconcile with our records. Our records, compiled from human communications monitored over 40 years of indirect contact and 14 years of formal registration, estimated the human population at approximately 9 billion, concentrated primarily on their homeworld with small frontier settlements on 3 other planets in their system. The first page of the inventory corrected this. 37 colony systems, not outposts, not frontier settlements, systems, plural, each one with its own infrastructure, its own defense complement, its own self-sufficient food and energy production. The smallest of them had a population of 400 million. The largest, a system they called New Providence, had a population of 3 billion and an industrial capacity that the inventory described, in the flat factual language of someone describing something utterly ordinary, as capable of producing 1 heavy warship per 11 days. Per 11 days. Our most productive shipyard, Conclave Central Production, 6th Ring, produced 1 heavy warship per 9 months. I looked up from the terminal. I kept my voice level. I said, "These figures represent current capacity." She said, "Those figures represent capacity, as of 18 months ago. We have improved since then." There was a pause. I asked how long the colony systems had been established. She said the oldest one, a system called Haverford Station, had been continuously inhabited for 61 years. 61 years. We had been monitoring human communications for 40 years and had detected none of this. Not one colony ship, not one colony transmission, not one piece of evidence that humanity was doing anything other than arguing with itself on its home planet, and occasionally sending things into the solar system to see where they went. I said, "How did you conceal this?" She looked at me for a moment, with an expression I could not read. She said, "We did not conceal it. We just did not broadcast it. There is a difference." Then she said, in a tone that carried something very quiet underneath it, something I felt rather than heard. After the event, we decided that some information was worth keeping close. The event. The second time I had heard that phrase. I had heard it first in the transmission, a brief reference, the kind of reference that does the work of a long explanation by refusing to be one. I wanted to ask. I made a professional decision not to ask. There would be time. Or there would not, and either way the question would wait. I turned back to the inventory. The second section covered what the humans called their strategic defensive architecture, which was a phrase that took me 3 readings to fully process, because each individual word was comprehensible, and yet together, they produced a meaning I was not certain I had the context to absorb. It described a network of monitoring systems, communication relays, and automated response platforms distributed across all 37 colony systems, and the space between them, integrated into a single coordinated network that could, according to the inventory's own technical summary, detect an unauthorized vessel entering human-designated space within 40 seconds and coordinate a response within 3 minutes. 3 minutes. The Kethul survey vessel had been inside the Oort cloud for 6 hours before it was detained. It had not been inside human space for 6 hours without being detected. It had been detected immediately. The 6 hours were something else entirely, something the inventory touched on in the third section, under a heading that read, in very plain human language, Engagement Protocols. I read the engagement protocols. I read them again. I said, "You gave them 6 hours to leave on their own." She said, "We gave them 6 hours to realize they were where they should not be and correct their course voluntarily. It is the standard first response protocol. Every vessel that enters our space receives the same 6 hours." I said, "And when they did not leave?" She said, "And then we introduced ourselves." I thought about the transmission. It has not responded. We are not concerned. Owen Garrett, who had not moved or spoken since sitting down, made a small sound that in his species I would come to recognize as the thing people do when they are trying not to add a comment that nobody asked for. He caught the director's eye. She looked at him for a fraction of a second, and he went back to being very still. I reached the 4th section of the inventory. I want to be precise about this moment, because it is the moment everything I had understood about the situation rearranged itself into something I did not have prior language for. The 4th section was titled, Strategic Assets, Classified Classification 1. Below the title, a single paragraph of introduction, written in the same flat, factual tone as the rest of the inventory. It said that the following section described a category of human military asset that had no existing conclave designation or classification, and that the inventory was providing this information voluntarily as part of the process of establishing accurate mutual understanding, and that the conclave should consider this disclosure an act of good faith, and that the information should be shared with all conclave member species immediately upon receipt. That last line, that it should be shared immediately, I understand now why she put it in. She wanted everyone to know at the same time. She did not want any single species to have a day and a half with this information, while others did not. She had thought about what that imbalance would produce, and she had decided against it before she ever walked into this room. I read the first entry. I read its technical description, its operational parameters, its range, its method of delivery, and the 3-line summary at the bottom that described what it was designed to do to a planet-scale body within range. I set down the terminal. Director O4 Marchetti was watching me. I said, "What is a planet killer?" The word for what she did next is not quite a smile. It is the expression of someone who has carried a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just set it down in front of another person and is watching them understand for the first time what the weight of it actually is. She said, "You are about to find out. The Kethul are going to help me explain." She stood. She had brought nothing except the data chip, and the data chip was in my terminal. She walked to the door, and Owen Garrett stood when she stood. and the woman with the glasses closed her tablet. At the door, Director Ofor Marchetti stopped. She did not turn around. She said, "Share the inventory tonight, Archivist. All of it. Do not summarize. Do not edit. Send the original file." I said I would. She said, "And Vrethka?" I said yes. She said, "The notice you read this morning, the one about us?" I said yes. She said, "You were very professional about it." She left. I sat alone in the reception hall with the inventory open on my terminal, and 12 human warships holding their positions outside, close enough that my terminal could read their hull designations, far enough that our point defense systems might as well have been decorative. I started reading from the beginning. I did not sleep that night. I do not think anyone in the conclave did. What happened next did not look like war. That is the part I need to explain carefully, because in the 412 extinctions I have recorded, I have seen war. I have seen its documentation, its aftermath, its archaeology. I have read the final transmissions of species that chose to fight when they should not have fought. I have cataloged the debris fields and the silence, and the sensor readings that show exactly how fast a civilization transitions from a living system to a notation in an archive. What the humans did with the Kethul home system did not look like any of that. It looked like a demonstration. The distinction matters. I am the archivist. I need you to understand the distinction, because it is the most important thing about everything that followed, and I do not want it buried under the technical details. The Kethul High Council had been in emergency session for 31 hours when the humans acted. I know this because my conclave counterpart assigned to Kethul diplomatic relations was transmitting live updates, trying to track the situation from the conclave end, and her reports were arriving in my terminal every 20 minutes, with the specific quality of documents written by someone who is trying very hard to sound composed, and is not entirely succeeding. Her name was Archivist Velthos, junior to me by 60 years, and she had never covered an active situation before. Her reports were thorough. They were also getting progressively shorter as the session continued, which is what happens when a person is watching something they do not have enough professional vocabulary to describe. The Kethul had received the full inventory. Director Ofor Marchetti's instruction had been followed. Every member of the conclave had the complete file, unedited, by midnight of the day she had walked out of Waypoint 11's reception hall. The Kethul ambassador in the conclave chamber had read the relevant sections in a silence so complete that I could hear the ventilation system cycling through its standard rotation. He had then asked for a recess. The chamber had granted it. The recess had become 31 hours of emergency sessions on the Kethul homeworld, Kethul Prime, a planet with 300 million inhabitants, 17 orbital stations, and a survey fleet that had been quietly cataloging the extinction of other species for 3 centuries, with the professional detachment of people who understood, at some level, that the safest position in the galaxy is the position of the witness rather than the participant. They had surveyed the wrong species. On the morning of the 32nd hour, a Kethul military officer, Commander Velthan, transmitted a message to my station. The message was addressed to the human fleet, with myself and the Conclave High Council copied. It said that the Kethul High Council wished to open formal dialogue regarding the unauthorized survey incident, and requested that the matter be referred to Conclave mediation procedures, and that pending such mediation, all parties agreed to a suspension of hostile activity. He transmitted it to my station because, apparently, no one had given him the direct frequency for the human command ship. That detail stayed with me. The Kethul, who had spent 3 centuries navigating the politics of the galaxy, did not have a way to contact the humans directly. None of us did. We had spent 40 years monitoring their communications and 14 years in formal registration, and at no point had anyone thought to establish a direct line, because at no point had anyone imagined they would need one urgently. I forwarded the message. Director Ofor Marchetti's response came back in 40 seconds. It said, "Noted. Stand by." 40 seconds to compose a response, and the response was 2 words. I forwarded that too. The human fleet had not moved since it arrived at Waypoint 11. The 12 warships in their precise, point defense irrelevant positions had simply remained there while the conclave received the inventory, and the Kethul held their emergency sessions, and my terminal accumulated 31 hours of diplomatic updates that I was summarizing into a report I had no idea how to title. I had started with developing situation, human contact, and changed it 3 times. The 4th version read simply, active status review. which told the reader nothing, and was therefore at least accurate. Then, on the morning of the 32nd hour, my long-range sensors registered a transit event. Not at waypoint 11, not anywhere near the Kethul home system, which was 11 light hours from my station. At the edge of the Kethul system itself. My sensor technician, a young Velari named Sorem, brought me the reading and stood next to my terminal, with the expression of someone who has just run a calculation 3 times and received the same answer each time, and does not like the answer, but has run out of ways to question it. I asked him what I was looking at. He said, "Vessels, 7 of them. They transited into the Kethul outer system approximately 9 minutes ago." I said, "What classification?" He said, "There is no classification. They do not match anything in the registry." I had the inventory open on my screen. I turned to the 4th section. I turned to the entry under Strategic Assets, Classified Classification 1. I looked at the technical diagram. I looked at the sensor reading. They matched. The planet killers were not ships in the way that I understood ships. I want to be precise about this because my archive record is supposed to be useful to whoever reads it after me, and imprecision here would be a failure of my responsibility. They were structures, large ones. The sensor readings put each of them at a scale that my terminal initially rejected as an error and had to be manually overridden to accept. They moved through space in the way that very large and very confident things move, which is to say, without hesitation, and without any apparent concern about what might be in the way. They stopped at the orbital perimeter of the Kethul system. Just stopped. They did not advance. They did not broadcast. They did not power any weapons systems, which I know because my sensors would have detected the energy signature and would have flagged it immediately. They simply arrived at the edge of the Kethul system and sat there, 7 objects of a classification that had no name in any registry in the galaxy, visible on every sensor array pointed in that direction, making no demands and activating nothing, just present. On every channel, for everyone to see. The Kethul sensors would have detected them 11 minutes after they arrived. I know this because that is when the Kethul emergency session, which Velthos had been tracking, went silent. The updates stopped arriving. The Kethul High Council had seen the same thing on their sensors that I was seeing on mine, and they had apparently found it necessary to pause whatever they had been discussing and simply look at what was sitting at the edge of their system. I was looking too. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, not because my feelings are the subject of this record, but because I think they are accurate data. I am an archivist. I have spent 219 years trying to understand things precisely. What I felt when I looked at those 7 shapes sitting at the edge of the Kethul system was not fear, exactly, though it had fear somewhere inside it. It was closer to the feeling of a very long calculation finally resolving, the feeling of a number that has been approaching from far away, finally arriving, and being larger than the estimate. The humans had not been loud. They had been quiet. They had been so extraordinarily quiet, for so long, about something so large, that the quiet itself was the most significant thing I had encountered in 219 years of professional practice. The human transmission arrived at the Kethul High Council 11 minutes and 40 seconds after the planet killers appeared on their sensors. I received a copy simultaneously, as Director Ofor Marchetti had specified from the beginning. It was not long. It said, "All Kethul vessels, military and civilian, are to withdraw from human-designated sovereign space, defined as all territory within 11 light-years of Sol, within 96 hours. Formal acknowledgement of this directive as a binding interim agreement is required. Acknowledgement can be transmitted to the conclave archivist at waypoint 11, who will serve as formal witness." It said, "We would prefer a peaceful resolution." It said, "We are prepared for other outcomes." That was the complete text. The Kethul High Council deliberated for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I have the timestamp. I checked it multiple times because I could not initially accept that it was accurate. A species that had spent 300 years watching other civilizations end. A species with 4 centuries of spaceflight, and the accumulated strategic knowledge of an organization that had catalogued every military error any other species had ever made, needed 4 minutes and 17 seconds to look at 7 objects sitting at the edge of their home system and decide what to do. 4 minutes. And then the acknowledgement arrived at my station, addressed to me as specified, formally worded, legally precise, carrying every required authorization code. It was one of the most complete and correctly formatted documents I had received in 20 years, which told me the Kethul had drafted it the moment they decided, with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that in some moments there is no value in delay. That the humans received it. 11 minutes after that, the planet killers withdrew. They did not leave through any transit point my sensors could identify. They moved to the edge of the Kethul system, and then they were simply gone, the way something disappears when it goes beyond the range of what you are able to perceive. One moment they were there. The next moment, the sensor readings showed empty space. Gone. No debris. No energy residue. No evidence that they had ever been there at all except the records, my records, and the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of a Kethul deliberation that would be studied for the next 100 years by every species in the conclave, trying to understand what exactly it was they had been looking at. I filed my preliminary report. Then I contacted Director HFY Marchetti. She accepted my communication with the promptness of someone who had been expecting it and had decided not to initiate it herself, giving me the space to come to the conversation on my own terms. I said, "You did not use them." She said, "No." I said, "You moved them into position, and the Kethul acknowledged within 5 minutes, and you withdrew them." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" She said, "Why did we not use them, or why did we withdraw them after the acknowledgement?" I said, "Both." There was a pause. Not a long one. She was not the kind of person who needed long pauses to find her words. She was the kind of person who already had her words, and was deciding which ones to use. She said, "We did not use them because the Kethul made the right decision. We withdrew them because we said we would if they did." I said, "And if they had not acknowledged?" The pause this time was different. Not her finding words, something else. She said, "Then we would have had a longer conversation." I said, "That is not an answer to my question." She said, "I know." I wanted to push further. I wanted to ask about the inventory and the 37 systems, and the shipyard that produced a heavy warship every 11 days, and the 7 shapes that had appeared out of nowhere and disappeared back into it. I wanted to ask about the event, the word she and every other human used the way you use a word when the full description of it is too large to carry in a conversation, and you have learned, over time, to carry it in a single syllable instead. Instead, I asked the question that had been sitting at the back of everything since she walked out of the reception hall. I said, "You deployed 7 planet killers to the edge of an inhabited home system. You achieved complete strategic compliance without activating any of them. You then withdrew them completely and immediately. Is that going to be your standard approach?" She said, "We would prefer it to be." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means we have tried the other way." The communication ended. I sat with that for a very long time. The 12 human warships outside my station had not moved during the entire operation. They had not needed to. They had sat in their positions with the quiet confidence of people who had planned for every version of this conversation, and trusted the plan, and had no interest in performing readiness, because the readiness was simply there, obvious to anyone looking, requiring no performance. I wrote my report. Then I wrote a separate note, personal, unformatted, not for the archive. I have kept it separate because it is the kind of document that belongs alongside the formal record, rather than inside it. In the note I wrote, "They built the most significant things I have ever seen. They moved them to the most strategically exposed point available. They achieved everything they needed to achieve, and then they removed them." I wrote, "I do not know if this is restraint, or patience, or something I do not have a word for yet." I wrote, "I am not certain there is a difference." The full session of the Galactic Conclave, 11 species, 142 delegates, and every senior diplomatic and military advisor, any of them could get into the chamber in 48 hours, convened at 900 hours, 3 days after the Kethul acknowledgement. I had not slept well in those 3 days. I record this not as a personal complaint, but as accurate data about the conditions under which the following proceedings occurred, and also because I suspect that nobody in that chamber had slept well either, and it seems worth noting that we were all doing our best under the specific difficulty of having received information that permanently rearranged something important, and being given 3 days to decide what to do with it. I stood at the podium. I had my report. 340 pages of inventory, 50 pages of my own analysis, the sensor records from the Kethul outer system, the full transcripts of my conversations with Director HFY Marchetti, the timestamp records of the 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and a personal note I had written and revised 4 times about what I believed it all meant when read together. I did not begin with the inventory. I began with a correction. I said, 3 days ago, I stood at this podium and read an extinction notice for a species called Homo sapiens. I stated, formally, for the conclave record, that the species was extinct. I stated that the galaxy had lost a young, chaotic, occasionally dangerous civilization, and that its passing was noted. I said other things at that podium, which were professional in their phrasing and which, on reflection, went somewhat beyond what the formal record required. I paused. I said, I am here to correct the record. The chamber was already still. It went stiller. I said, species designation Homo sapiens, commonly known as humans, is not extinct. The following is a revised assessment of their current status, capabilities, and intentions, based on information provided voluntarily by their government in the 72 hours following the notification error. I use the phrase, notification error. It is the formal term for an incorrect extinction notice. I had designed the form for it 30 years ago, in the theoretical confidence that I would never need it. I had been wrong about that. I use the correct term here, and I note that using it in a full session with 142 delegates present was one of the more professionally significant moments of my career, and not in a way I had anticipated. I read the inventory. Not all of it. The chamber did not have 340 pages of patients, and my job was not to bury them in data, but to ensure they understood what the data contained. I read the numbers that mattered, the 37 systems, the production rates, the monitoring network and its response timeline, the engagement protocols that gave unauthorized vessels 6 hours to reconsider before the humans introduced themselves. The Velari delegate, Thos Elar, who had the particular quality of attention that made you feel your words were being catalogued as you spoke them, raised her hand when I reached the section on the monitoring network. She said, "This network has been operational for how long?" I said, "The oldest components, according to the inventory, are 43 years old." She said, "We have been in indirect communication with humanity for 40 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "They were monitoring us for 3 of those years before we knew they existed." I said, "That appears to be the case." She sat back. She did not speak again for some time. The Dorothi delegation conferred among themselves in their clicking language, which carries across a chamber regardless of whether the conference is intended to be private. I caught fragments. Not because I was listening, but because Dorothi conference voices are built for distance. What I caught was mostly numbers. They were running the shipyard calculations. 11 days per heavy warship, 37 systems. The math of what that produced over 60 years of continuous industrial operation, with no external witnesses. I let them run the calculation. The answer was going to reach them regardless of when it arrived. The Kethul ambassador had not spoken since the session opened. He sat in his position with the very careful stillness of someone who had been shown something large and close in his own home system, and had made a decision about it under observation, and was now sitting with the full weight of that decision in a room full of people who had watched the timeline of it recorded to the second. He spoke when I reached the section on the planet killers. He said, "I would like to add a supplementary witness account to the archive record." I said, "The floor is yours, Ambassador." He said, "The objects designated planet killers by the human inventory appeared on Kethul sensors at 0700 hours, system local time. Our sensor arrays required 11 seconds to complete an initial reading. Our tactical division required a further 40 seconds to confirm the reading was not an instrument error. Initial analysis of scale and configuration took 18 additional minutes. A complete and accurate picture of what we were looking at took..." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was very level and very careful. "Approximately 4 minutes. I said, "That aligns with the acknowledgement timestamp in my records." He said, "Yes." He said, "I want the record to reflect that the Keth-Ul High Council's decision was made with complete information and full deliberation. It was not made under panic. It was not made under duress in the conventional understanding of that term. It was made under the specific condition of having looked at something, understood what we were looking at, and understood clearly what all available options and their outcomes looked like from where we were standing." He stopped. I said, "The record reflects your statement, Ambassador." He sat back. The chamber held this. Then Thos Elar said, "Archivist, the question I need the record to address." I said, "Yes." She said, "The humans moved 7 of these assets into position at a system boundary. They achieved complete compliance without activating any of them. They then withdrew. What would have happened if the Kethul had refused? The chamber did not move. I said, I asked Director Ofor Marchetti this question directly and specifically. Thoseller said, and what was her answer? I said, she declined to answer with specificity. She indicated that the situation would have continued toward a different resolution through further steps in their engagement protocol. Thoseller said, and what is your interpretation of that answer? I said, my interpretation is that she declined to be specific, for the same reason that one sometimes declines to describe a consequential outcome before it is necessary. The information is accurate. The description would not have been constructive at that stage of the conversation. The Dorathi delegation had finished their calculation. I could tell because the conference voices had stopped, and Senior Delegate Karam, the most senior of their group, looked up from his terminal, with the expression of someone who has arrived at a very large number, and is taking a moment to become settled with it, before speaking. He said, Archivist, the production figures in the inventory. I said, yes. He said, we have attempted to reconcile them with what we know of human industrial history, and what was detectable from our monitoring over 40 years of contact. They do not reconcile. I said, no. He said, which means either the figures are constructed to create a false impression of capability, or human industrial development has proceeded over the past 60 years, at a rate we did not detect, did not predict, and do not currently have a framework for explaining. I said, the sensor data from the Keth-Ol outer system, combined with the direct visual confirmation of Classification 1 assets, provides substantial support for the figures being accurate rather than constructed. He sat back. I let the chamber hold that. Then I set down my report. I said, I would like to offer an observation that is not standard procedure in a formal session report, not as part of the formal record itself. As the person who has spoken directly with Director Ofor Marchetti on 4 separate occasions, read the complete inventory, and reviewed the sensor data from the Keth-Ul system, as someone who has spent 219 years studying how civilizations end, and has never, until this week, been in the position of studying one that did not. The chamberhead, Konthal, looked at me with the patience of someone who has seen enough unusual things to stop being surprised by deviations from standard procedure. He said, proceed, Archivist. I said, we are spending a considerable amount of this session on the question of what the humans could do. How many systems? How many vessels? What the production rates produce over time? What the Classification 1 assets are capable of? What the answer would have been if the compliance had not been given? I said, these are the right questions. I am not suggesting we should not ask them, but I believe they are incomplete without the question we have not yet asked, which is the one I think is most important. Thoseller said, which is? I said, what have the humans chosen not to do? The room was quiet. I said, the engagement protocols give 6 hours before contact. The inventory was disclosed before it was requested. The Classification 1 assets were withdrawn, the moment compliance was received, with no additional demands, and no further conditions. The directive to the Keth-Ul was copied to every conclave species simultaneously, so that no single government had information the others did not. I said, each of these is a decision. Each of these decisions required choosing one approach over another. 6 hours is longer than necessary for tactical purposes. Simultaneous disclosure reduces any strategic advantage that comes from information asymmetry. Immediate withdrawal after compliance is generosity rather than leverage. Copying all species equally is costly in terms of negotiating position. I said, a species that makes these decisions consistently, across multiple situations, in the middle of a confrontation in which they held every material advantage, is not making random choices. These are the decisions of a civilization that has decided, at a structural level, what it intends to be. The policies reflect the decision. The decision was made before any of us were watching. The chamber was still. I said, the question I cannot answer, and I want this on the record, is when that decision was made, and what preceded it, and what the cost of arriving at it was. I believe the answer to those questions is connected to what the humans call the event. I believe that is where the inventory comes from, and the protocols, and the 6 hours, and the immediate withdrawal. But I do not know the details of the event, and the inventory does not provide them, and Director Ofor Marchetti has not offered them. I said, what I can tell you is that a civilization that builds something, and then builds a framework to govern when and how it uses that thing, is afraid of itself in a very specific way. They know what they are capable of. They are trying to be careful with it. Karam said, or they are creating the appearance of restraint. I said, that is a reasonable concern, and I cannot dismiss it. He said, you do not believe it. I said, I believe that the operational record over the past 72 hours is more consistent with genuine structural restraint than with a performance of restraint. But I acknowledge that my belief is an interpretation, and interpretations of this significance should be held carefully. He said, what does your interpretation recommend? I said, that we take the offer, that we accept the seat, the recognition of their territory, the sole exclusion zone as defined, and the notification protocol as written, that we do so because the alternative is not a different negotiation. The alternative is a situation where the humans are not at the table, and the inventory exists regardless. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Konthal said, the chair notes the archivist's observation and the interpretive recommendation, both of which will be included in the session record as supplementary material. We will proceed to formal deliberation. The session ran for 11 hours. I will not record all of it. There were arguments that deserved the time they received, and some that did not, and 3 separate recesses, during which various delegations communicated with their home governments, and came back with positions that had shifted in ways that told me the conversations at home had gone roughly the way I expected. Fear is clarifying. When the alternative is visible on your sensors, the negotiating position tends to focus. At the end of the 11th hour, the chamber reached a preliminary determination. Humanity would be offered a formal seat at the conclave, not as a junior registered species, not as a treaty-obligated observer, a full seat, founding category, with voting rights and formal recognition of their 37 colony systems as sovereign territory, and with the sole exclusion zone accepted as defined. In exchange, full inventory updates on an agreed schedule, maintenance of the engagement protocols as described, and advance notification before deploying any asset at or above Classification 1. Notification, not permission. That distinction had consumed 2 of the 11 hours, and the final language had come from me, in the 4th hour, when the chamber had narrowed to the specific problem of how to describe what the humans were agreeing to do. I had said, they are not agreeing to ask permission, they are offering to tell us first. Those are genuinely different things, and the language of the treaty should reflect what is actually being offered, because if we misname it they will notice, and we cannot afford to begin this relationship with a misreading. The chamber had accepted this. I had filed the preliminary determination. Then I had walked out into the corridor and stood with my back against the wall for a while, in the way a person does after being in a very loud and consequential space for many hours, and thought about the treaty text, and whether I had read the situation correctly, and whether in 200 years a future archivist would read this record and find my interpretation embarrassing or accurate. Trelosh came and stood next to me. He said, do you think they will accept the terms? I said, yes, the terms are close to what they wanted. I think they were waiting for us to arrive at something like this. He said, what were they waiting for before that? I looked at the corridor wall, which was the standard pale gray of all conclave corridor walls, uniform and unremarkable. I said, for us to understand what we were looking at, for us to read the inventory properly, and ask the right question, the question about what they chose not to do. He said nothing. I said, they have been out here for 60 years without talking to anyone. I think they were ready to stop. The amendment to the extinction notice required a new form. I had to design it from scratch. 30 years ago, when I had created the theoretical version after a particularly long night of reviewing what I considered highly improbable edge cases, I had not built a complete template because the need had seemed so remote that allocating formal infrastructure to it felt like spending resources on a problem that existed only in imagination. So I built one now, at the end of 219 years, for the only entry in 413 filings that had ever needed it. It was 12 words. Notice issued in error. Species persists. Record corrected. Archivist. Vreth Ka. Cycle 7441. The form had a notes field. Standard guidance said notes were optional and were typically left empty. In 3 decades of handling the theoretical version, I had never specified what the notes field was for, because I had not expected to use it. I used it. I wrote for 2 hours. I deleted sections and rewrote them. I started with the technical language appropriate to a formal archive supplement, and found, somewhere in the second draft, that I was writing something different. something that was for the record in the way that a letter is for the record. Not to document what happened, but to document what it meant to be in the room when it happened. I will reproduce here what I kept. I wrote, "Humanity is not the species we filed them as. They are not a young civilization that survived its early development and turned out to have more industrial resources than our estimates suggested. They are a civilization that has already lived through its own ending and decided, from inside that experience, to become something different from what it was before. I do not know the full details of the event. I know its consequences, which are written into every page of the inventory, and every decision Director Ofor Marchetti made in the 72 hours between the first transmission and the treaty signing." I wrote, "The restraint is structural. It is not a policy that can be reversed by a change of leadership or a shift in political conditions. It is built into the protocols, the engagement timelines, the disclosure requirements, the simultaneous notification of all parties. You build those things into systems when you have learned, at significant cost, what happens when they are absent. The inventory is a document of current capability. It is also a document of a civilization that decided what it intended to do with that capability, and then built the architecture to hold itself to the intention." I wrote, "They gave us 6 hours. They gave the Kethul 96 hours. They gave the conclave 3 days to read the inventory, and another 3 to deliberate before the treaty session. Every timeline in the entire engagement was longer than it needed to be for strategic purposes, and shorter than it could have been if the intent had been delay. They were giving us exactly enough time to understand and respond, and not one moment more than that. This is not the timing of a species that is in a hurry or afraid of what deliberation might produce. It is the timing of a species that is confident in its position and committed to giving others the space to find their way to the same position through their own understanding." I wrote, "The galaxy is not a simpler place for the existence of humanity. It is a more complicated place in ways that will take time to fully understand. But I believe, and I record this as the interpretive conclusion of 219 years of studying how civilizations relate to each other and to their own capabilities, that it is a less dangerous place than it was 3 days ago. Not because the planet killers don't exist, because the species that built them also built the 6-hour protocol, and the simultaneous disclosure requirement, and the immediate withdrawal after compliance, and the offer to come to the table and talk about all of it." I set that down and read it back. Then I added one more paragraph. I wrote, "I asked Director Ofor Marchetti, at the reception following the treaty signing, what the event was. She said it was them. She said they had been very fortunate that enough of them survived to decide to be different afterward. She did not say more than that. I did not ask for more. The inventory contains the consequence of the event in every page, and the consequence is sufficient for the record. The details belong to them. The day of the treaty signing had the particular quality of days that begin before anyone expected to be awake. The preparation had been organized under a compressed timeline, and it showed in the small ways that preparation always shows when the timeline is compressed. A seating arrangement adjusted twice, an environmental control setting that required manual correction, a Dorothy delegate who arrived at the wrong docking arm and had to be redirected. None of these things mattered. They accumulated into the specific texture of a significant day. The diplomatic hall had been reconfigured. More seating, better lighting. The conclave flag and the human flag placed equidistant from the signing table, in the precise geometry that protocol required, when neither party was the host, and neither was the guest, when both were meeting as something they had not been before. 6 conclave representatives, including myself in the formal archivist role, Director Ofor Marchetti for the humans, with Owen Garrett to her left and the woman with the glasses to her right. Director Ofor Marchetti came in last. She sat down across from the conclave representatives, and she looked at the table, and at the treaty document laid out on it, and then she looked up, and looked at each of the conclave representatives in turn, not quickly, taking a moment with each one. When she reached me, she stopped for a second longer than the others. I do not know what she was looking for. I do not know if she found it. She looked away and picked up the document, and read through it carefully, every page, while the room waited. This is not how treaty signings typically proceed. Typically, the parties have reviewed the document extensively in the preceding days, and the signing itself is a formality. She knew this. She was reading anyway, deliberately and completely, and I understood while she was doing it, that she was reading because the document was real, and the moment was real, and she was the kind of person who treated real things as real things. She signed. She passed the document to Owen Garrett, who witnessed. She passed it to the woman with the glasses, who also witnessed, and whose name I finally obtained from the formal witness record, Constance Webb, Deputy Director for Strategic Agreements, United Earth Defense Directorate. I had wondered for 3 days. The answer had been in the formal documentation the entire time, and I had simply not retrieved it until the moment required it. After the signing, there was a reception, as protocol specifies. I spent most of the first part of it standing beside a table of human food that someone on the human delegation had provided, as a gesture of the kind that requires some cultural confidence to make well. I was examining it with the careful interest of a person who has spent considerable time thinking about a species and is now faced with concrete evidence of what they consume and how they have arranged it for presentation. Director Ofor Marchetti came and stood next to me. She looked at the table. She picked up something small and placed it in my hand and said, "Chocolate. You are not required to eat it, but you should know what it is." I held it. She took one herself and ate it, and looked at the wall in the way people look at a wall when they are actually looking at something much further away, something that is not in the room. I said, "You read my session notes. The section where I said I believed you were trying to stop being alone." She said, "Yes." I said, "Was I wrong?" She was quiet for a moment. She was not searching for words. She had the words. She was deciding.
60 years.
"No," she said. 60 years is a long time to build without talking to anyone. The colony systems were necessary, and we do not regret them. But necessity and preference are different things. We preferred this. I said, the notation protocol. The 6 hours. The simultaneous disclosure. She said, "We spent a long time writing those." I said, "I could tell." She turned and looked at me. She said, "Could you?" I said, "They are the decisions of a civilization that has had to think carefully about itself. They have the specific quality of conclusions reached after a great deal of other options were considered and rejected. You can see it in the structure." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Yes." Then she said, "The inventory describes what we have built. It does not describe what we decided not to build, or the conversations that produced the protocols, or how long those conversations took. I did not include those details because they are not appropriate for a first document." I said, "But they exist." She said, "They exist." I said, "I have one question I have not asked." Owen Garrett, 2 meters to her left, went very still. Constance Webb stopped writing. I said, "The event. What was it?" She looked at me. She was not calculating. She had already decided whether to trust me, or she would not have been standing here. She was doing what she had done with the treaty document, treating a real thing as a real thing, giving it the full moment it required before moving through it. She said, "Us." She let that sit. Then she said, "The event was us. We came very close to finishing what we almost finished, and a sufficient number of us survived to make a different decision. That is the complete account." She said, "It does not sound like enough for everything it produced." "It is." She picked up another piece of chocolate. She did not eat it. She looked at it. She said, "Vrethka, the notice you wrote, the one about us being gone." I said, "Yes." She said, "What did you write in the notes field of the amendment?" I said, "I wrote that you are a civilization that has already lived through its extinction and decided on the far side of it to become something different. I wrote that the restraint is structural. I wrote that the galaxy is less dangerous, not because you do not have the capability, but because you built the framework to govern it, alongside the capability itself." She looked at the chocolate in her hand. She said, "That is a generous reading." I said, "It is the accurate one." She put the chocolate down on the edge of the table and looked at the room for a moment, at the 11 species occupying the same space, with the slightly careful quality of people who are learning a new arrangement and have not yet settled into it. She said, "We will be good members of this conclave, Archivist." She said it the way she had said everything else, not as a performance, as a statement of something already decided. I said, "I believe you." She nodded. She walked away. Owen Garrett walked with her. Constance Webb gathered her tablet and followed. I stood for a while next to the table of human food, holding the small piece of chocolate, and then I ate it, because she had said I should know what it was, and eating it seemed like the correct way to know. It was sweeter than I expected. I went back to my office that night, and I finished the amendment notes with the final paragraph I had been holding back through 4 drafts, because I did not know yet whether it was accurate. And then, standing in the corridor after the reception, I had understood that it was. I wrote, "If you are reading this record in the future and attempting to understand the humans or predict their behavior, I can offer you this. Read the inventory. Read it as a biography, rather than a threat assessment. Read what they built, and when they built it, and what they built alongside it, to govern how it would be used. Read the engagement protocols and the simultaneous disclosure requirement, and the immediate withdrawal terms. Read these things not as policies but as decisions, and ask what kind of civilization makes those specific decisions in those specific circumstances." I wrote, "They gave themselves 6 hours. They gave the Kethul 96 hours. They gave us 3 days and then 3 more. Every timeline was long enough for understanding, and short enough that understanding was the only available use of the time." I wrote, "A civilization that does this knows what it is. It knows what it could do, and it has decided what it will do instead, and it has built the difference between those two things into the architecture of every system it operates. That is not a performance. It takes too long to build a performance that thoroughly." I wrote, "The amendment is filed. The record is corrected. The species persists." I wrote, "Do not refile." Then I set down the notes and looked at the archive terminals in the cold blue light that has surrounded this work for 219 years, and I thought about 413 extinctions, and the one that was not, and the woman who had sat across from me and placed a data chip in the center of the table, with her hands folded, and waited without impatience for me to understand what I was looking at. I thought about 12 words on an amendment form. Notice issued in error. Species persists. Record corrected. For 219 years I have written endings. This is the first time I have written something that is not an ending, and I do not yet have a proper name for what it is. I believe that is correct. I believe some things should arrive without a name, and be given one only after you have lived with them long enough to know what the name should be. The humans, I think, understood this before any of us. They built 60 years of quiet, and then they answered a eulogy with an inventory and a data chip, and a woman who read a treaty from beginning to end, in a room full of people waiting for her to skip to the signature. They knew exactly what they had. They wanted us to know too. Now we do.